Welcome everybody. My name is Andrew Matner. I'm Director of Altitude Advisory. Thank you for joining us today. I'm joined by my business partner and Director of Catapult Wealth, Tony Catt, and more importantly, joined by a special guest, Warren Hogan, who is a journalist for the Australian Financial Review and also the Chief Economic Advisor for Judo Bank. And Warren's going to spend some time with us today speaking about various economic issues that we're currently experiencing. Warren, thanks for joining us, mate. Can you just start by telling us a little bit about your background and career in the economic sector?
Well, thanks for having me, Andrew. Tony, it's great to be with you. So I am an independent economist, having a background in banking and financial markets through my career. I now am the managing director of my own company, Economist. My main clients include Judo Bank, and I am obviously quite present in the media, including writing columns for the AFR from time to time. And really, I say it as I see it. I don't have any particular masters, and I've spent my whole career trying to understand where the economy and markets are at, and more importantly, giving it my best shot on where it's all headed. So I look forward to discussing various issues with you over the next few minutes.
So Warren, one of the biggest issues facing Australia, if not global issues at the moment, has been the labour shortages that our economy is facing, and a lot of people are asking, where is this headed, and what impact is it having on the economy, and what impact will it continue to have on the economy? I wonder if we can just start there and get your thoughts and future thoughts about where it's all going.
Yeah, it is certainly the crisis point in our economy, which, you know, us economists have got a great way of looking at the negatives of everything, because the flip side of this, of course, is we've got historically low unemployment. If you want a job, you can get it. And of course, policymakers, whether it be the RBA or government and Treasury, are very happy that they've got unemployment to near 50-year lows. But this has been a great outcome from the pandemic. But the thing I've observed by speaking to businesses across Australia for the last few years is this isn't coming without some cost. It's actually a great representation of the major imbalances in our economy coming out of the pandemic. And until we get our labour demand and supply back into some sort of balance again, it's going to represent a major challenge for all organisations in Australia, not just businesses, but anyone who has staff. To give you some idea of how severe the situation is, over the long term being, say, the last 10, 15 years, Australia generates about 20,000 jobs a month on average. And that broadly reflects the new supply of labour coming into the economy. And half that supply of labour is what we call a natural supply, or natural increase in population, people coming out of school or uni or back into the workforce. And half of it's from immigration. And the demand for labour from organisations, businesses, government has broadly matched that. Sometimes it's a bit stronger and unemployment's heading down, and sometimes it's a bit weaker. But the wiggles through time are very modest. Right now, and I'll show you some charts on this, the demand for labour is represented by indicators like job ads and, most importantly, job vacancies, is telling us that Australian organisations need about 30 or 40,000 staff a month. Now, that's fine. That's strong. But, of course, we have suffered one of the biggest shocks to our economy through the pandemic in the form of the closing of our international borders. And although they're open now and have been for most of 2022, the fact that they were shut for 2 years means we lost about, well, the estimates vary from 600 to 800,000 people who would have otherwise come, but by temporary and permanent visas. And of course, now that the borders are open, they don't all suddenly come back, or we don't suddenly hit our targets in here. We're getting 10,000 people coming in a month, let's say, but we've got a lot of catch up to do. So the supply of labour, and a great way to represent this is in working age population growth, is running well below normal. So we've got demand running at almost twice the normal rate, and supply, well, at one stage at the end of last year, half the normal rate. And so this is really creating big disruptions that have become quite clear. It is ubiquitous, and that's a great word because it means it's everywhere. It doesn't matter what occupation, what skill, what industry, what part of Australia you're operating in, everyone is experiencing this problem. It's put an absolute premium on staff retention. It's put a lot of pressure on businesses to be clear about their investment plans. And of course, it's been very disruptive. The real issue from an economy point of view is just starting now and in 2022, and that is the inevitable price response, that is wages. They're starting to move. So not only is this issue, which initially was a disruption for many businesses, a pain in the backside, you might say, it's now becoming a financial issue. And wages, I think, are starting to pick up quite quickly. And this, I think, is going to be a real hallmark of the competitive environment in this country through to 2023. And that is businesses are going to come under pressure to pay staff more, and then, of course, pass that cost on to their customers in the form of higher prices, which, of course, is the inflation we're seeing. And those businesses that can't are going to suffer a margin squeeze and may ultimately fail. And so this is one of the key themes for our economy in the year ahead, is that there is going to be resilience, I'm sure. The economy actually has got quite a strong footing, but there will be pockets of distress in the business community, distress in household sectors. And it'll be quite a wide variety of experiences that we see. And of course, we're going to hear lots of different stories. It'll be quite a challenging environment for policymakers to read this situation. But of course, this labour crisis, this labour shortage crisis, I should say, has to be resolved. And our economy won't be back on an even keel, as the governor now says, which, you know, I'm not a sailor, but it's a good term to describe back to a steady state, back to some sort of equilibrium, as an economist would say. We won't get there until we get this labour shortage resolved.
Warren, I guess my first question around that is then, you know, globally, are we going to attract our fair share of people in a post-COVID world? I mean, like we did pre-COVID. I mean, is the world changed that much where we just can't assume it will go back to normal, or in an attraction sense?
I think that's an excellent question. And I've got two sort of data points here. One, we aren't getting temporary visas back into the country, even though we're, for all intents and purposes, open for business. We're healthy and we're every bit the great place to come and work as a backpacker and young person, broadening their horizons, but they're not coming back. And I think that reflects the fact that this is a global phenomenon. And prior to COVID, Australia was an attractive place for young people, particularly out of Europe, which had very high rates of unemployment, very high rates of youth unemployment. And that situation there has changed a lot as well. This is a global phenomenon. That's the first data point. The second data point came out of the new Albanese government's desire to attract nurses. We know that that was an election promise. And they were quickly wrapped on the knuckles just a few weeks ago by the, I think it was the International Union of Nurses, saying that it is not fair to just poach nurses from other countries where they're experiencing shortages. So there's a sort of a global IR perspective on this, as well as obviously the realities of just trying to get people here. It also points to another phenomenon, which this is at the core of what this labour shortage is, and that is that we've seen a long-term shift in a demographic cycle in the last 10 years, which is really now coming home to roost, and that is the retirement of the baby boomers. The dependency ratio, which is essentially the ratio of all the people in our community who don't work, typically young and old, to those of working age, that's shifting upwards after experiencing a number of decades of decline. And of course, what that tells us is there's emerging labour scarcity. Now, this is happening and is well advanced in Japan, parts of Europe, but it is a global phenomenon. China has got a severe demographic turn happening. Really, only some parts of Southeast Asia, Africa have young and favourable demographics still. So this is a big shift in the global environment. And what it means is that although we hope this crisis point will pass for labour shortages related to the pandemic all around the world, but here in Australia, the labour shortage story is here to stay. And it's a very different operating environment for the 2 decades prior to the pandemic. So businesses in particular, but really all organisations, and I would encourage governments to get involved in looking at investing in labour saving technology. Now, smart businesses have been doing this for a long time. Businesses that have got acute skills shortages have been doing this for a long time. But this really is a foundation, I think, of the economic cycle ahead. This is a longer term view for the next sort of 5 to 10 years. And I think business investment is going to be a crucial driver of economic activity around the world because businesses are investing to save labour. And it's not because they don't want to employ people, it's because they can't. And there won't be the social blowback because it won't be in an environment of elevated unemployment. And that is actually the very good news about this new world we're entering, and that we've entered with a bang through the pandemic, is that people will have jobs, unemployment will typically be lower than it has in the past. And of course, this is also going to put sort of a general upward pressure on real labour costs, which, have actually been falling. I know no one in Australian business will ever tell me that labour is cheap. It is actually one of the most expensive labour markets in the world. But the reality is that when you adjust for productivity and adjust for inflation in Australia and all around the world in the last 2 decades, labour has been getting cheaper or effectively cheaper. That's going to shift, I would say. So there's a real imperative for all organisations to find labour saving technologies, and if they can't, they're going to have a very difficult time in their marketplace. Is my guess.
Yeah. Well, and just a quick question on that. You mentioned obviously that margin squeeze and the need to pass on prices and then the potential business suffering or failing as a result of that. Can you see any particular industries or sectors that you think might come under more pressure than others?
Look, it is generalized now, these labour shortages, but I imagine that as the crisis point recedes over the next few years, there will be particular industries. Look, in a wealthy, aging society, the demand for health workers is going to continue to grow. And we've already seen that as the single biggest shift in the structure of the industry structure of employment in Australia in the last 20 years. Of the sort of 16 odd industry groups, the only 2 major shifts in employment share have been a big decline in manufacturing and a big increase in healthcare workers. And we now have over 2 million healthcare related jobs in Australia, with about 1.9 million Australians working in those. Obviously, some people working 2 jobs. And this is everything from childcare through to disability and aged care and general health. So that health side is going to continue to be problematic, and it's the largest employer. And then there's going to, I think at the other spectrum, it's going to be the skill side. Despite the disruption to international labour mobility, i.e. travel, through the COVID period, particularly in Australia, Australians with skills are often willing to move, and they're more likely to move to London or Singapore than they are from Adelaide to Perth or from Sydney to Brisbane, it appears. So where those highly skilled workers, I think, are also at the other spectrum. So I think your low and semi-skilled workers and your very high skilled workers are going to be at the crunch point. But it's hard to predict exactly these things. And I think all industries should be, all business people and all organizations should be aware of this issue and be prepared to really invest in their staff, and also look at how to get the most out of everyone that spends every hour on the job.
Do you, one last question from me was around, how do I best describe it? I mean, a lot of clients sit here and talk a bit about where did all the people go, and I think you've answered part of that around the demographics with the baby boomers. And I think part of that is described by the immigrant, the backpackers and immigration. Is there some argument around the participation rate to some degree as well, Warren? I mean, with people going back from 5 days to 3 days, or and now maybe looking at going back the other way through cost of living pressures and things like that. Do you see much change in that area?
Look, the internal dynamics of our labour force have been extremely favourable and the government has supported it. The previous government made childcare more affordable, and that had a noticeable impact on participation. The new ALP government is targeting further moves on that front. The reality is that it was the closed border that had the big impact on Australia. Whereas if you look at the United States, it's exactly what you said. What's going on there has been a structural shift down in participation through the pandemic without a full recovery. And in fact, just in the last few months, the latest US payrolls reports, the monthly employment numbers there have shown participation falling once again, and still, again, well below where they were pre-pandemic. So we don't have that problem. Our participation rate hit a record high last month. Obviously, female participation has been where most of the actions happened for decades now. But we are not only dragging more and more people into the workforce of working age, but the other big shift has been people over, let's say 55, extending their careers. And I'd say that's going to remain a phenomenon. But the reality is how high can that go? And what do we want as a country? Do we want to be a working nation? I know the mortgages are pretty solid in Australia, but there is in the end, people will make their choices. And one of those choices in our society anyway has been for retirement, especially now that we can enjoy a retirement because we can live long enough to enjoy it. So I am worried that the gains we've had in participation can't be continued to be repeated. But I think Australia is actually really well positioned in this world, better than most other countries, in the sense that we know how to run immigration, both temporary and permanent visas. And what we're seeing in 2022 is the permanent visa applications go right back to normal. So they're about half skilled, half family, and they're all there. They're all getting filled. The temporary visas is what's lagging. Now, the government says some of that is processing. And I read a report that says there's over 350,000 visa approvals that have not yet been processed. So hopefully some technology will help the government improve that run rate, and we will get those people back. And on a longer term view, we are more readily able to deal with these challenges of labour scarcity through immigration more than most other countries. In fact, the country that's suffering the worst, Japan, part of the reason their demographic cycle has been sharper and earlier than other countries is that they have no real immigration programs. And that's a call on their part. That's a social choice. We made a social choice a long time ago, I believe, that we are a migrant nation, and we've proven to be very good at it. And that's going to be a great skill for our society over the decade ahead. And I think another box to tick in why you don't want to bet against Australia in the decade ahead.
Agreed.
Okay, so this first chart is the best two indicators of labour and supply and demand. It's across the whole economy. It's job vacancies up until May. We will get an update before long. It's only a quarterly series. And then working age population, the annual change. And I've mapped them together so that you can see that they sort of moved broadly in line. I only have 5 years of history, but the important point is that this really is the biggest shock to our economy is the pandemic. And that is the demand for labour literally going through the roof and the supply collapsing. The RBA will be focused on getting those job vacancies down. Part of that will be as immigration reboots, but part of it's going to have to be a slower economy and less demand for labour. Those two lines need to come together to take some of the pressure off the economy, particularly the wage and inflation pressure. This is the overseas arrivals and departures data on the left. This includes everyone. So it includes Australians leaving, coming home. It includes tourists. It just paints a picture to show you how far below pre-pandemic levels we are. We're heading in the right direction, and we're heading there rapidly in 2022. Long way to go though. But, hopefully by the middle of next year, we'll be getting back to some semblance of normal. On the right is a great chart of the numbers for net overseas migration into Australia to 1860. This is literally one of the longest time series on Australia I've seen. It's a great chart. I love history. And you can see, obviously, the big hit to migration that happened in the pandemic, and then the government's current program, which the ALP has made no noises about changing what Dutton and Morrison put in place in November 2021, when they quite politically successfully got the new immigration program and plans for immigration going under the radar. So they've got it going back to normal of a net flow of 235 within a few years. But unlike the two other previous hits to immigration associated with World War I and World War II over 100 years ago, there's no plans for a catch-up. So we could be left with a bit of a hole in our labour force of around 700,000. It's hard to pin that down and whether that'll be an ongoing problem, but it does highlight this risk that the immigration story will take a year or two to really play out. This is real unit labour costs. Okay, so this is essentially wages adjusted for productivity of the people who are working and adjusted also for the inflation, i.e. the ability to pass those higher costs on to customers. This is economy-wide. So this is really important to understand that line essentially tells you labour has been getting cheaper in Australia in a real sense, but some industries are going to be a lot more productive than others. And so this doesn't represent the experience of all industries. And I think there's many service industries where this is not the case. They haven't been as productive. They haven't been able to pass it on, and there'll be some real pressure coming through. But as an economy-wide phenomenon, one thing that we shouldn't worry about is that a burst of higher wage growth, which we're going to get, is going to suddenly crunch into business profitability and investment, and eventually the economy will turn down. That's not going to happen economy-wide, at least not in the short term. The labour market is experiencing a pickup in turnover, the biggest we've seen in 30 years. So labour turnover on the left is the percentage of the workforce that's moved jobs in the last 12 months. It's been falling for 40 years or for 35 years. It's only annual data. It only comes out February each year. Well, it comes out in July for February. And you can see that between February 21 and February 22, a sharp upward increase, albeit from a very low level, being the biggest increase in labour turnover, as I said, for 30 years. I think it's actually the shift in labour turnover that matters for market conditions. So I've just put together a chart there of labour turnover, the change in labour turnover versus wages. There's some correlation there to sort of confirm my thesis. Probably not the strongest relationship, but I think we all would understand that if people start looking for work elsewhere for higher wages, that's a feature. So we're seeing labour turnover and we're seeing wages start to go up. This is the forecast for employment on the central case, the narrow path for this economy to get back onto that even keel, to get back to normal over the next few years, with both the Treasurer's forecasts and the RBA's forecasts essentially represent. And within that, even though we have a noticeable soft landing for the economy, employment is still going to grow. So we're not going to get a collapse in demand for outright demand for labor in this country. It's just going to slow down. And hence why this crisis situation won't suddenly disappear. Labor won't be going from being in short supply to being okay in the next few months. It literally will take us well into 2023. Unless, of course, we experience a severe downturn, which in the next year or so, no one's anticipating. That's a risk factor for further down the track. But highlighting that the demand for labour needs to moderate, but it won't go away. It's just there's too much underlying strength in the economy. These are the dependency ratios. They're a big picture story. Obviously, I just want to touch this for people to have a look at. And you can just see how these charts go back 50 odd years. All of the charts there, with the exception of India, are showing a turn in the dependency ratio higher. And effectively what it means is that everyone in the community consumes, but only the working age produce. And as the proportion of the community that's a working age shrinks, It means, well, there's more pressure on them, and there's a whole fiscal story, a whole government story around this and government finances. But of course, it also means that labour gets relatively scarce. And although those cycles turned around 2010, I believe we're now starting to see the manifestation of that in the economy. And that's, for me, the foundation of this view that businesses who are dealing, well, all organisations that are dealing with labour shortages now should be going headlong into investments in labour saving, because it's not just about this crisis point of 2022 or the early 2020s. This is going to be an issue that is going to last for literally decades, which I think is absolutely critical. So that's my summary of the labour market story. At the core of it is obviously great opportunities, and the fundamentals don't change. People need to skill themselves. Businesses need to skill their people. Labour retention, staff retention, as well as attraction is a fundamental. And the businesses that will succeed, of course, are going to be those that are able to manage their labour force well in this environment, which clearly very few of us have seen in our working lives. It represents a major challenge for all organisations going forward.
Yeah, and obviously the ability to pass on those costs where they can.
That's absolutely central. It's happening. A recent survey of SMEs that we did at Judo Bank, 1,700 across Australia, all industries, so a substantial sample, showed that particularly for mid-sized organisations and businesses, they're passing it on. And we're seeing that now. We've had that confirmed with the recent Q2 CPI, which showed another very big quarterly increase in prices, an annual increase of 6%. That really tells us that the inflation world has shifted, and businesses are now passing these costs on pretty readily.